Emancipation, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson, is an American idea. But if it was an idea that had to live locked in grotesque embrace with the pervasive reality of slavery, legal, prominent, and flourishing in American life. Elsewhere in the civilized world, well, that is to say, everywhere in what people in America thought was the civilized world, which was mostly the European world, slavery and forms of slavery seemed to be rapidly heading for the exits as a labor system. In Tsarist Russia, Emperor Alexander II issued an Emancipation Manifesto on March 3, 1861, all of 400 pages in length, and complete with 17 statutes covering the implementation of emancipation that freed the serfs of Russia from bondage. Closer to home, a bill for the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire was passed by the House of Commons on June 12, 1833, liberating, right on America's doorstep, the entire African slave population of the British West Indies. And until the 1830s, it seemed likely that American slavery would go the same way. Unlike the West Indies, the American South was unencumbered with a single great cash crop like sugar that required gangs of slaves in order to ensure profitability. Without that, many Americans at the time of the Revolution were sure that slavery in America would soon wither and disappear. The abolition of the British slave trade was accompanied by the institution of slave ship patrols in the Atlantic Ocean by the Royal Navy. And this kind of interference with the Atlantic slave trade further diminished the prospect of sustaining slavery in America. And if the economics and the politics of slavery were not enough to doom it, then many people felt that the example of the American Revolution would finish the job. Many Americans were acutely embarrassed by the contradiction posed by a war for independence and liberty, which still kept thousands of black people in slavery. The difficulty Americans had in reconciling the exercise of slavery with our professions of freedom pushed several of the new American states to eliminate slavery, or at least to set it on the path toward elimination. The Vermont Constitution of 1777 and the New Hampshire Constitution of 1779 both banned slavery outright. In Massachusetts, the new state constitution of 1780 declared that all men were born free and equal. And on that basis, the slave, Quoke Walker, successfully sued his master, Nathaniel Jennison, in the Massachusetts courts for his freedom. Still, like many other reform movements that we've looked at in this course of lectures, abolishing slavery was not always quite what it seemed to be. Many of these emancipation plans adopted by the states were gradual emancipation plans, not immediate ones. And under the terms of those gradual emancipation plans, many slaves would remain slaves for years to come. Some, in fact, would remain slaves for a lifetime. Other emancipation programs wanted to follow emancipation with some form of deportation or colonization of the freed slaves. The British had set the pattern for this by establishing a freedmen's colony on the West African coast at Sierra Leone, establishing one colony there in 1787 and then reestablishing it in 1791. And the American Colonization Society followed suit in the 1820s by establishing a colony for freed American slaves in what they optimistically called Liberia. And in too many cases, American opinion turned in favor of emancipation because in the years after the Revolution, it was simply convenient. Americans, especially in the North, found more than enough in the way of cheap labor in the new flood of white immigrants from Northern Europe, and they were more than happy to send America's unwanted and despised blacks packing to something that paternalistic and racist whites liked to think was the home of black people. But there was sincere and sympathetic opposition to slavery among some white Americans, and much of that developed from the most fertile seedbed of reform, and that was evangelical revivalism. Few of the Great Awakeners began with any particular convictions about slavery. Jonathan Edwards, for instance, bought, owned, and sold slaves himself. But Edwards was also the author of ideas which outpaced his own practice, and that became especially evident in his followers, Samuel Hopkins and Joseph Bellamy, the New Divinity men. At the end of his life, Edwards had set himself to the thankless task of reconciling Calvinism, which taught, remember, the absolute control by God of every human action, with the Enlightenment's fierce embrace of freedom. Now, Edwards did this in his monumental work of 1754, Freedom of the Will, which demonstrated at least in logical terms, how divine predestination and divine control was compatible with the fullest human freedom to choose. Now, from that, Hopkins and Bellamy developed the notion that any restriction on human choice was, on those grounds, an insult to God. Moreover, according to Hopkins, one's choice to serve God must be total, disinterested, which, by the way, does not mean uninterested, it means impartial, although today we tend to use the word disinterested as though it meant uninterested and bored. It must be total, it must be disinterested or impartial, and it must be immediate, or else it's a fraud manufactured in hell. Now, a slave, of course, had no such power to choose. Hence, slavery should be opposed as a travesty of God's reconciliation of his own decrees and human freedom. And if slavery should be opposed to God's will, then to oppose slavery was a duty that demanded absolute commitment. And so, radical New England awakeners and revivalists, from Hopkins to Charles Grandison Finney, swung fervently into the anti-slavery column. And not only New England revivalists, Pennsylvania Quakers also swung slowly toward opposition to slavery between 1750 and 1800. And so did a number of smaller sects who saw their own fragile standing in American life as something akin to slavery. And so they rallied to the cause against slavery. In the South, where slavery was the most heavily concentrated, many Southerners were inclined to agree with these criticisms. The crop which had demanded slave labor in the 17th century, tobacco, was in the 18th century no longer the prize of North American agriculture. From 1715 onwards, Chesapeake tobacco exports to Britain fell to half the rate of growth that they had enjoyed before 1680, while tobacco prices fell disastrously between 1680 and 1740, and rode an unpredictable roller coaster of boom and bust thereafter. As the profitability of tobacco waned, so did the enthusiasm for slavery. Virginia removed legal restraints on individual emancipations in 1782, and emancipation societies were organized in both Virginia and North Carolina. Then, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Southerners offered remarkably little resistance to the Constitution's indifference to slaveholding. Although close to half the delegates of the Constitutional Convention were slaveholders, comparatively few efforts were made to give slavery any kind of explicit federal recognition or protection. Instead, the new federal government created by the Constitution would have the power to regulate or even abolish the import of slaves after 1808. And even the word slave was conspicuously avoided throughout the document. Southerners who wanted their slaves counted for the purpose of determining representation in the new federal House of Representatives, and thus giving the South an undeserved weighting of representatives in the House, were forced to settle for counting only 3/5 of their slaves in order to make up their congressional delegations. The frequent, sincere, and earnest assertions and discussion of the natural rights of mankind which took place during that time led the friends of the Revolution to interest themselves in a plan of promoting the gradual abolition of slavery. So wrote Tench Coxe, who became secretary of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society and spearheaded the drive for an Emancipation Act in Pennsylvania in 1780. And when the first Congress, under the new Constitution, assembled in Philadelphia in 1790, among the first petitions laid before it were two from delegations in New York and Pennsylvania asking for the immediate abolition of the slave trade. Perhaps even more significant than the Constitution, in 1787, a federal ordinance for organizing the Northwest Territories, the modern Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Minnesota. That ordinance, the Northwest Ordinance, declared that there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory otherwise than in the punishment of crimes whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. The hour of emancipation is advancing, wrote Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Northwest Ordinance. It will come. But at the end of the 1700s and at the beginning of the 1800s, two fatal inventions changed this expectation. The first was born in England in the form of the new series of artificially powered machines that we saw in the lecture on the Industrial Revolution, beginning with the spinning jenny, which eliminated the handwork which had gone into the making of textiles from time out of mind. Within a generation, cheap, mass-produced textiles had laid the foundation for a new British Empire and, of course, the Industrial Revolution. Now, the second fatal invention was the cotton gin, which was invented by the New Englander Eli Whitney in 1793. The cotton gin transformed the processing of raw cotton by eliminating the tedious need to pick the cotton clean of seeds by hand. And the gin automatically separated the fiber from the seeds by the simple means of a hand-cranked roller. The cost of cotton production dropped, just as the hunger of England's textile mills was growling ever louder, thus putting within the grasp of the American South a new cash crop almost as fantastically valuable as sugar had been to the West Indies and much more valuable than tobacco had been to the Chesapeake years before. Between 1790 and 1850, American cotton exports to Britain leapt from 12 million pounds a year to 588 million pounds of cotton. And the labor to which American cotton planters turned in order to realize the profits which cotton held out as the white gold of the Industrial Revolution was, predictably, that of black slaves. Between 1790 and 1810, the number of slaves in the United States, instead of diminishing, rocketed upwards from a little less than 700,000 to almost 1.2 million. And by 1860, over 3.9 million slaves labored across the American South. Now, if profits were one reason why Southerners turned their backs on emancipation, fear was another. In addition to profits, the growth of the Southern slave population created a dense and growing mass of hostility among the slaves, which could easily bubble up into insurrection if people talked too freely about liberty and emancipation. In August of 1791, acting on the promptings of the French Revolution, the black slaves of the French Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue staged their own slave revolt, lurid with the massacre of thousands of white planters. And a 2-year civil war ensued among the slaves for control of what remained afterwards. The memory of Saint-Domingue, reinforced by a handful of abortive slave revolts in Charleston and Maryland in 1739, in New York City in 1712, and again in 1741, and then slave revolts led more recently by Gabriel Prosser in Virginia in 1800, Denmark Vesey in Charleston in 1822, and, above all, Nat Turner in Southside, Virginia in 1831. These revolts, going all the way back to Saint-Domingue, rendered Southern slave owners rigid with anxiety at the very whisper of emancipation. Then, in 1839, a cargo of slaves on the Spanish slave ship Amistad rose in revolt, seized control of the ship, and massacred all but 2 of the white crew with cane knives from the ship's cargo. The Amistad drifted into United States waters, where she was seized and the slaves put on trial. But despite the howls of anguish from slaveholders, the United States Supreme Court ordered the slaves freed and returned to Africa, thus offering to Southerners not only a vision of what their own slaves might have in store for them, but an inkling that their northern countrymen might not be willing to do anything to prevent it. It was, however, the Turner insurrection in 1831 which had the most direct impact on Southerners. Turner and as many as 50 recruits butchered 57 white men, women, and children in a 40-hour spree that convinced the Virginia State Constitutional Convention to close the door completely on any move by Virginia toward emancipation. Turner raised the specter of mass racial murder and convinced hesitant and on-the-fence whites that slavery was the only means of protecting themselves from the bloody consequences of emancipation. So, faced with the need to protect their region's economy, and with the terror posed by Nat Turner and by the example of the Amistad, Southerners turned their backs on emancipation and began manufacturing a pro-slavery ideology to suit their economic needs and their racial fears. Instead of apologizing for slavery as a relic of the past, they now began devising means of arguing that slavery was in fact a good thing that should be continued into the future. One part of this pro-slavery ideology was based simply and purely on racism, except that this was no longer the simple racism of the 18th century, which merely sorted people out on the basis of color and powerlessness. In their rage against the rationalism of the Enlightenment, the Romantics of the 1800s glorified non-rational standards for human understanding, where the Enlightenment taught the fundamental identity and sameness of all human beings and downplayed distinctions based on non-rational considerations like race or nationality. Romantics like Joseph Gobineau taught the sublime power of nationalistic feelings and based those feelings on racial or national characteristics. Races, in other words, were no longer merely different. They existed in a hierarchy, with Africans securely subordinate to white Europeans. The physical characteristics of Africans, whatever they were supposed to be as apart from any other human beings, were measured by Alabama physician Josiah Clark Knott in order to show that Africans were fit only for enslavement and physically incapable of participating in anything so universalistic as a common human desire for freedom. Blacks were fit for slavery, and blacks, in fact, enjoyed slavery. Now, of course, it was never explained how this fitness and enjoyment of slavery allowed these same blacks to be quite capable of revolt in the name of freedom, but that kind of explanation was not important when you were dealing with an ideology. Those Southerners who found raw racism too crude chose to justify slavery on the basis of paternalism. They defended slavery as a kind of benign household institution in which slave workers lived side by side with their masters as one great big harmonious family. Of course, in real families, one does not normally sell members of the family to other families, and this was where the analogy usually broke down. Others defended slavery on simple economic grounds. In every society, explained South Carolina's James Henry Hammond, there must be, in every society, a kind of lumpen proletariat, a kind of lowest of the low among the working classes, who are willing to perform the basest tasks that no other class is willing to perform. There must be, said Hammond, who was borrowing an image from house construction, there must be in every society a mudsill on which the rest of the house's frame can rest. In a country where labor was expensive and choosy, the only way to create such a mudsill class was by enslavement. And the most likely candidates for enslavement were blacks. Now, this was putting things more crassly than other Southerners wanted to be. George Fitzhugh, for instance, did not try to justify slavery on the grounds of mudsill necessity, but he did argue that the South's enslaved mudsills were no worse off than the wage labor mudsills of the northern factories. The Negro slaves of the South are the happiest and, in some sense, the freest people in the world, George Fitzhugh intoned in 1856. The northern worker, said Fitzhugh, is actually more of a slave than the Negro because he works longer and harder for less allowance than the slave and has no holiday because the cares of life with him begin when its labors end. He has no liberty and not a single right. Nevertheless, for all of these arguments, many Southern slaveholders were plagued with doubts about slavery. Many feared the envy and resentment of non-slaveholding Southern whites who struggled to compete economically with big plantations run on slave labor. And they tried to promote the notion that enslaving black people guaranteed a kind of white man's democracy, in which all whites, no matter how different they were in every other respect, all at least shared a common superiority to black people. The brutality of slave mastership also took a moral toll of the masters, because it was impossible for them not to be conscious of the exploitation that they were guilty of. Those especially who had any form of religious conviction found themselves doomed to constant self-torment. Above all, slaveholders were nagged by the fear of suffocation. Cotton, fully as much as tobacco, wore out the soils of the oldest Southern states. And when that happened, slaveholders in those states would either move further south or sell their slaves further south. The more slaves and slaveholders crowded into the shrinking amount of cotton-growing soil, the more likely it was that the price of slaves would fall and wipe out the investment slaveholders had made in earlier slave purchases. Slaves, remember, were a capital investment. If that investment lost value, the Southern economy would collapse. And the Southern economy would collapse if there were too many slaves and too little land to expand into. Now, by contrast with these developments in the South and the emergence of the pro-slavery ideology, nothing might seem more unlikely than the sudden rebirth of an emancipation ideology in the North in the 1830s. Not only because this emancipation ideology seemed to come from nowhere at once, but also because the form it took was radical, militant, and absolute in its demands that slavery be abolished at once, for all, and forever. The gadfly of this new abolitionism was William Lloyd Garrison. His newspaper, The Liberator, founded in 1831, spoke in the piercing tones of a romantic revivalist. "I am in earnest," Garrison said. "I will not equivocate, I will not excuse, I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." Now, in retrospect, Garrison and the abolitionists cut a far less admirable figure than they hoped to. To the dismay of many of his political supporters, Garrison favored what he called non-resistance. That was his word for total withdrawal from the political process. And he scandalized some of his closest sympathizers by burning a copy of the Constitution on the grounds that the Constitution was a league with death and a covenant with hell. Garrison split the first national anti-slavery organization, the American Anti-Slavery Society, by trying to promote the female abolitionist, Abby Kelley, to the Society's business committee. And he alienated his evangelical backers by relentlessly criticizing the lukewarm response of many churches to emancipation. All told, Garrison probably attracted more hatred than recruits from other Northerners. And those whom he did recruit had their own unappetizing aspects. Numbers of them, like, for instance, Elijah Lovejoy, were also anti-Catholic bigots. And Garrison himself had no sympathy with the working classes, or at least none that approached the passion he had against slavery. Or some abolitionists were like Wendell Phillips, a Boston Brahmin who manifested a kind of status anxiety and seized hold of the abolitionist cause as a means for recovering the kind of social deference that the Brahmin class was starting to lose in the new industrial society. Southerners, however, looking at the abolitionists as they did through a gauze of fear and self-interest, saw none of abolition's weakness or divisions, and Southerners instead behaved as though the entire North was covertly supporting the abolitionists. South Carolina Governor James Hamilton thrust copies of Garrison's Liberator under the noses of state legislators, claiming that Nat Turner's revolt had been excited by incendiary newspapers and other publications put forth in the non-slaveholding states. And the legislatures of South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and Alabama formally overtured the legislatures of 10 northern states in 1836 with requests that the publication and distribution of newspapers, tracts, and pictorial representations calculated and having an obvious tendency to excite the slaves of the slave states to insurrection and revolt be made a criminal offense. Elaborate systems of slave patrols were imposed, and state laws encouraging emancipation in the South were repealed. Even religious denominations, Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, were split by Southerners who could not rest with anything less than complete and total approval of the slave system. Never mind that no connection between Nat Turner and William Lloyd Garrison was ever demonstrated. Southern pressure forced Postmaster General Amos Kendall to turn a blind eye when Southern postmasters began censoring what they regarded as suspicious mail and suspicious newspapers from the North. And Southern congressmen persuaded the House of Representatives to impose a gag rule that prevented the introduction and debate of anti-slavery petitions on the floor of the House. The violence with which Southerners defended their peculiar institution, even up to the point of entrenching on the First Amendment, looks quaint and I think perhaps largely irrational to us today. Were they not overreacting? We will tend to think that, though, only if we assume, with the benefit of hindsight, that slavery was an inevitably doomed institution. If we look at slavery as Southerners looked at it, we will instead see a labor system that was economically profitable, which was expanding quite healthily, thank you, in terms of both its numbers and its geography, which was already starting to realize its potential adaptation to industrial rather than just agricultural labor, and which was looking to the west and saw land in Mexico, which could be seized and converted to slave agriculture and thus ensure the future of slavery. And so they looked, and they found the opportunity ripe for war.